Explained by the Billy Meier contacts. Mysteries, myths, legends, conspiracy theories, historical inaccuracies, and more. Compiled by David Chance, revised October 18, 2023.
Santorini Caldera Minoan eruption, see also the destroyer comet. Contact Report 005.
Then, 3,453 years ago, the destroyer penetrated the terrestrial solar system and brought the planetary orbits into disorder by its gigantic forces. Passing close to Earth, it enshrouded latter in its huge tail and shook it very hard. Immense storms and volcanic eruptions were the result. Human beings and animals died in large masses, mountains were shifted, and the ocean depths changed. In the Mediterranean Sea, the magma walls of the Santorini volcano were torn to pieces deep down, and large quantities of water penetrated. This caused an immense catastrophe, since the volcano exploded thereby and destroyed the island. The explosion created a gigantic storm surge, which grew nearly 200 meters high into the sky and swept over the sea like a primeval monster. Everything in it was killed and crushed, and the water turned blood red. In Egypt, this storm surge flooded vast areas and caused all sorts of epidemics. While the tidal wave receded and continued racing northeast across the sea to destroy vast areas and all port cities on the eastern shore of the sea in present-day Syria.
Contact Report 055.
Atlantis was divided into two kingdoms. The Great Atlantis was located between the divided continents of America, South America, and Europe, Africa, while the Small Atlantis was located in the Santorini region. Small Atlantis was destroyed about 6,000 years later, indirectly by the gigantic destroyer, the giant comet, which brought Venus into the Sol system 3,500 years ago. The enormous vibrations of the destroyer racing by and the following Venus caused enormous damage on Earth. It trembled, burst in many places, and huge volcanoes erupted. One of them was the existing Santorini. It exploded and tore various islands down into the sea within a wide radius, while the sea began to bubble and an approximately 2,000-meter-high tidal wave was generated, which rolled over today's Crete to Egypt and Syria. Minoa remained an island, but most of the islands of Little Atlantis around Santorini sank.
Contact Report 061.
For about 1,000 years, the Earth was spared from major catastrophes until the year 6906 before 1976, when the destroyer once again caused enormous devastation on the Earth and destroyed many things. After that, the Earth ball became very quiet, and it took until the year 3453 before another catastrophe broke out, which was again the fault of the giant comet destroyer, which drove Venus into its present orbit and triggered the Santorini catastrophe with its massive pulling forces. But then, 3,453 years ago, the destroyer, which had regained the 575.5-year constant, came back, shot past the planet that was constantly thrown out of orbit at a distance of a few 100,000 kilometers, and finally tore it into its orbit, which Venus now inevitably and finally had to bring to Earth. After a short time, the destroyer shot past the Earth, in its wake Venus, which came very close to the Earth and caused the Santorini catastrophe.
Contact Report 125.
Thus, that language which was spoken by the people of the Minoans and which, by these, was taught to the ancient Hellenes Greeks, together with many things of their culture at that time, until the Santorini volcano exploded about 3,500 years ago and the Minoans had to flee to the mainland.
Contact Report 150.
Year BC, 1453 destroyer gets dangerously close to the Earth and causes severe catastrophes. Earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, elemental storms, and floods of enormous proportions are the result. Volcanic ash easily eclipses the sun, which lasts for several weeks. The Santorini volcano in the Hellenic Sea explodes, triggering a 180-meter-high tidal wave that rolls across the Mediterranean and far into the Nile country of Egypt, flooding everything. Not only do many human beings die as a result, but also countless animals whose carcasses decompose after the flood rolls back, causing much evil. This event triggers the 7 biblical plagues Moses' time, Moses, whereby the waters of the Nile also turn red through the blood of the countless life forms killed and their torn and battered bodies. The flood that rolls back again pushes back across the Mediterranean and forward to the northeast, where it then floods Syria and causes tremendous terror and devastation. My time travels with Ascot have taught me the correctness of the dates and information you have given, but I have recently read in various writings that the time of Moses and the Santorini eruption are calculated in completely different time periods. These calculations and assertions run from the 1500 BC empires back to the 5th millennium BC. Why is that?
It is because of the time falsifications of the chroniclers, whereby the Jewish chroniclers and other chroniclers influenced by them committed the worst evils in this respect, whereby time falsifications in the transmission of data up to several thousand years became apparent. The Santorini erupted and exploded due to the powerful influence of the destroyer exactly 3,453 years ago, calculated back from 2000. Whereby Moses lived at the same time and prepared the exodus for the Hebrew Jewish people in Egypt at that time. These dates are correct, as you could see for yourself from your travels with Ascot into the past.
Contact Report 182.
The Pleiaren explain that the earthly devices and apparatus for age determination, and also the purely chemical age determination processes are very sophisticated, and to a large extent exact, so that good and sometimes even approximately exact age determination results can be produced by the scientists, but that in age determination processes with certain materials, and which exceed an age of 1,438 years, B.C., erroneous results occur, which can result in an error difference of up to 1,942 years. And this takes the form, it is explained by the Pleiaren, of a material older than 1,438 years BC, having suffered atomic degradation, whereby 1,942 years are simply missing from the decaying process. This, it is explained, affects the accurate measurement of the half-life decay of certain materials by up to 1,942 years, which means that anything measured and analyzed with an age of 1,450 years BC, for example, can actually be up to 1,942 years older, in this case 3,392 years BC, because 1,450 BC and 1,1942 add up to 3,092 BC. The Pleiaren further say that this blatant change in certain materials of the Earth came about because the human beings of the Earth, through their madness, caused atomic and chemical processes in all spheres, geosphere, atmosphere, chromosphere, stratosphere, etc., which produced certain radiations, which influenced and changed certain materials on the Earth in such a wise that disturbances occurred in the atomic and molecular balance, and caused changes in various materials of greater age than 1,438 years BC. As it is explained, whole half-value structures are said to have been erased, so that an exact analysis is only possible if the missing time of the half-value structures of 1942 is added to or subtracted from the obtained result. If the obtained age determination is over 1,438 years BC. This also explains the difference between the Pleiarens and the Earth scientists' statements. For example, in the case of the Santorini catastrophe and the time of Moses, which is given by the Earth scientists as approx. C. While the Pleiadian state, the time of 1453 BC. The Pleiadians' data for the time of Moses and the Santorini catastrophe up to the year 1511 B.C. result in a difference of 1,142 years. Thus, the difference to the assumptions of the earthly scientists, who assume the events around Santorini and Moses to have taken place approximately in the time of 1500 BC, an assumption that is understandable when one considers that they do not include the missing 1,042 years of transformation and change of certain earthly matter in their calculations, because they lack the necessary knowledge of this fact.
Contact Report 213.
Two factors were to blame for the fall of the Minoan culture, namely, on the one hand, the disorder of the Minoan society, which was very divided in some respects, and which created evil hatred in the various social structures, even due to the disagreement that the Minoan Empire threatened to fall apart. The cultural structures split apart, and soon the whole thing threatened to degenerate into a war of the entire citizenry, and, thus, of all levels of society. But before this could happen, a tremendous natural disaster occurred, namely as the Santorini volcano erupted and burst forth lava, gas, steam, and ash, whereby the ashes alone exhibited the large amount of 73.6 cubic kilometers. Also vast sulfur fumes belonged to this, whereby the whole atmosphere was so polluted and shrouded in a veil that the sun was darkened, and climate changes emerged from this, which lasted for several years. Low temperatures arose from the veil of smoke and dust in the atmosphere, which caused many years of harvest failures. The bad and poor harvests led to the Great Famine during the following period. In addition, the Santorini volcano did the rest, for as a result of its powerful eruption and the subsequent explosion, which triggered gigantic tsunamis that devastated the large areas of the Minoan island when the waters raged across the island, many buildings and lands were destroyed, while very many people lost their lives. The largest tsunami, however, the huge tidal wave caused by the explosion of the volcano, rolled far across the sea to Egypt, being red with the blood of countless slaughtered aquatic animals, whereby the river Nile then colored itself red, and many people in Egypt died. But the tsunami found no end in Egypt and rolled back into the sea, where it united with another tsunami, which was generated by the explosion of the Santorini volcano, and rolled eastward, where the country was destroyed once again and people were killed when the wild waters penetrated into the country.
Contact Report 225.
Tsunami is the right designation, as these wild waters are called among you. They reach speeds that sometimes exceed 1,000 kilometers per hour, such as that gigantic tidal wave that emerged when the Santorini volcano in the Mediterranean Sea erupted and exploded, whereby the waters advanced far inland into Egypt and caused much life to die, and the Nile to turn red from all the blood.
Contact Report 361.
Regarding the eruption of the Santorini volcano, Ta dictates the following. Greetings, Christian Frainer, and understand well what I have to explain. You write the following to our friend Edward. Ellenberger points out another point which in his opinion should not be true, namely the eruption of the Santorini volcano. According to Ketzel, page 288, this happened in 1453 BC. Ellenberger thinks that more recent research of the last 20 years has shown that this event happened around 1700 BC. And it should be explained that our very accurate records correspond to the fact that the Great and Santorini destroying eruption of the volcano did not take place around 1700 BC, but undoubtedly in 1453 BC. My great-grandfather Hilak witnessed the event, and made accurate records of the catastrophe. According to the annals, the Santorini volcano has often erupted and was endangered by natural gas and seawater eruptions from time immemorial, which actually caused it to explode when water and natural gases burst into the magma, forming an explosive mixture that led to the catastrophe. So it is not correct that the destruction of the island by the Santorini volcano took place in 1700 BC, but actually in 1453 BC. Other statements are therefore just as wrong as insufficient research results of a geological or other kind. But it is also a fact that the frequent eruptions of the Santorini volcano over hundreds and thousands of years have created deposits that bear witness to the eruptions of the volcano. The volcano has had several major eruptions in the last 2,400 years BC, of which there were 3 between 1500 and 1760 BC alone, along with several smaller ones that were not too significant. In total, the entire ground and subsoil has changed so much that no exact reference points can be found for all small and large eruptions. In particular, the huge explosion of the Santorini volcano in 1453 years BC threw the actual eruption material far out to sea, leaving hardly any traces on the remains of the once beautiful island and its surroundings, although older ones are easy to find. Thus, everything is evident from the records of my great-grandfather.
Contact Report 401.
It has now become apparent that in recent years, research has been carried out into the plagues in Egypt during the time of Moses, and it has actually come to the attention of researchers that these proven plagues were caused by the eruption and destruction of the volcano Santorini. However, they date the events of that time to a completely wrong time, namely about 200 years before the time that Meier and Quetzal called. Scientists have found out that the enormous ash cloud of the exploded volcano reached Egypt, causing a so-called physteria epidemic to break out. Although this is not mentioned in the report of the conversation regarding the ash cloud, and therefore not in the quoted Meier once mentioned it in a private conversation, as did Quetzal. All aquatic animals and many land animals died, and the water of the Nile turned red because of the blood of the fish, animals and humans, who were affected by rashes all over their bodies. Then there was a huge tsunami, caused by the volcanic explosion, which was about 200 meters high, 180 meters to be precise, and which rolled deep into the land, killing a great deal of life once again, and also contributing to the epidemics.
The earthly scientists are very wrong if they date the whole thing to another time. Going back to the year 2000 AD, it is 3,153 years since the events took place. So, counting from today, the catastrophe happened 3,158 years ago. There is nothing to be done about it, even if the earthly scientists give different dates. But if they do, then this may be due to the fact that for the first centuries backwards, false results are obtained due to changes in the materials to be tested, which results in false time results.
Contact Report 492.
But speaking of the Santorini disaster, scientists claim to have found evidence that the Santorini volcano exploded around 1603 BC. New evidence is supposed to prove this by means of a carbon analysis, which was made of 2 pieces of trees from that time. It is also claimed that the tidal wave caused by the volcano explosion was only 30 meters high.
These are nonsensical claims that are not compatible with reality. In fact, the explosive destruction of the volcano Santorini took place in 1453 BC, and I am aware of the matter regarding the tree fragments found and the carbon analysis, but the tree fragments found are those that can be traced back to a severe eruption of the volcano Santorini, about 150 years before the Great Catastrophe. Due to the gigantic ejections of the volcano, the trees from which the fragments originated were completely enclosed by falling volcanic material at the time and thus preserved, so to speak. Santorini was a very active volcano with many small and also with large eruptions, whereby several times also smaller and larger tidal waves were caused. Between 1500 and 1760 BC alone, we recorded 3 major eruptions. When the volcano exploded in 1453 BCG, my great-great-grandfather Hylak witnessed and recorded everything. But the waters were piled up to a huge surge about 2,000 meters high, which, however, collapsed again and then moved at high speed as a 180-meter high tidal wave over the sea. This tidal wave then also reached Egypt and flooded everything up to very far into the country, whereby with the enormous tide also much pumice stone and various other things were washed into Egypt. In the process, countless living creatures of many different kinds were crushed and killed, also many human beings, whereby the Nile turned red. This was also due to the enormous masses of red algae that grew on the bottom of the Nile and were torn open by the raging waters of the tidal wave. Together with the blood of the countless shattered creatures, they contributed to the red coloration of the Nile. The killed creatures and the brackish waters led to swarms of billions of insects and all kinds of parasites, which caused epidemics.
Contact Report 507.
Quetzal explained to you what really happened because a lot of human beings, animals, and creatures were killed. According to our records, there must have been a total of millions who were shattered by the force of the tsunami and whose blood stained the water red. But it can be said, as our annals show, that in addition to the blood-colored water, there was another factor that made the water of the Nile appear red, because blood algae grew at the bottom of the river, which shimmered through the water to such an extent that the Nile appeared blood red. But what you think about a blood veil, that was probably the opinion of Quetzal. So it was 2 factors that interacted, because the blood of the shattered life forms alone would never have been enough to turn the Nile such a red color that it was so visibly red. So when Quetzal spoke of the Nile turning red through the blood of the killed life forms, he was not thinking of a total red coloring, but only of a veiled red coloring of the water.
By this, I mean, for example, if I take a glass of water and pour 1 or 2 drops of red liquid into it, which creates a faint red coloring, it is really not to be assumed that the Nile's water was thoroughly saturated with blood when it turned red, but only that it was veiled in red by all the blood.
This comparison corresponds to the situation at that time, so it must be assumed and also understood as such.
Contact Report 534.
Yes, I recently saw another TV program about Santorini and the Aegean Sea, what happened there in earlier times. And as I know, the Aegean is one of the most dangerous areas on Earth in terms of volcanic activity under the sea, along with the Yellowstone Caldera, the Eifel region, Iceland and Hawaii, etc. The Aegean region also includes Santorini, where the Santorini volcano blew up some 3,500 years ago. And it is precisely for this reason that I would like to ask whether there is a danger in the future that the activity of the Santorini volcano, which is still deep underground, will once again become outwardly active. The same question also applies to Vesuvius.
This is undoubtedly the case for both, although in extreme cases the consequences will be monstrous.
Contact Report 551.
Then there is the question I wanted to raise. In the course of time, Simyase, Quetzal, you and I have spoken several times about Santorini, where about 1,453 years ago, before Emmanuel the volcano blew up respectively exploded, and which then also caused the Great Plagues in Egypt. On the one hand, it was explained that the Nile was discolored by the blood of countless animals, as well as by red algae. But then there was also the fact that so-called dead water was mixed with it, which became red due to lack of oxygen. Where did this red water come from?
We call the dead water this way because it no longer contains any life in it due to an absolute lack of oxygen. It can occur in great depths of the sea or in enormously large lakes, when the water streams no longer circulate the water to the bottom and no longer supply it with oxygen. The red coloring of the Nile is due to the enormous amount of animal, creatures, and human blood as well as red algae, but also to dead water, which was washed out of the depths of the Mediterranean by the gigantic tidal wave after the explosion of the Minoan volcano Thera, as it was called in former times, or Santorini today, into the Nile and into the interior of Egypt. The dead water was washed out of a very deep and extensive volcanic trough by the eruption under the foot of the Santorini in the Mediterranean Sea, carried away by the gigantic tidal wave and driven into Egypt. The volcanic depression under the volcanic foot was formed in 1603 before Emmanuel's time, BC, when the Thera volcano, also in a tremendous eruption, caused a far-reaching catastrophe, which also affected Egypt and Syria, but not to the same extent as in 1,153 years before Emmanuel. Another major eruption of the same volcano also occurred 1,554 years ago, of course also before Emmanuel's time. But all three eruptions are very significant.
Contact Report 665.
It is clear that the Greek volcano Santorin, formerly called Thera, was the real reason for everything, but other questions remain unanswered. So it would be interesting to know what caused the 3-day eclipse, for example.
In addition, I can tell you from our records that the volcano Thera erupted twice in a short time in enormous manner, whereby with the second eruption during hours, a gigantic black ash cloud was hurled up, which spread over the whole southern Mediterranean Sea and afterwards also over Egypt, and covered during 3 days the whole Niland into the so-called Egyptian darkness, as this darkness of several days is called since ancient times. After this ash eruption, the Thera volcano collapsed, forming the Santorini ring crater that still exists today.
Then the question, what caused the bodily ulcers in the Egyptian population?
This happened by sulfur rain, which rained over Egypt as a result of the Thera eruption. This sulfur rain was so corrosive that it burned itself on the skin of humans and animals of all genera and species, causing ulcers and swelling and open and inflamed wounds.